I'd like to turn the session over to our guest presenter today, Dr. Brian Underdown. As I mentioned, he's currently a venture partner with Lumira Capital. Brian's also previously their managing director who concentrated on investments in North American therapeutic companies at all stages of development. Brian's also worked with Pasteur Mérieux Conat and was Associate Dean of Research at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine and at McMaster University's Faculty of Health Sciences. He himself holds a PhD in immunology from McGill. Within AllerGen, Brian's a member of the Network-Supported Intellectual Property Advisory Committee, a mentor in the AllerGen Mentorship Program, and a former member of the Research Management Committee. We eagerly look forward to him sharing his expertise with us today and providing insights into how best to attract investment and partners to support our research and innovation endeavors. So, Brian, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Diana. I noticed that there's a wide variety of people on the call, and this is going to be partnering light, and for others, hopefully, there'll be some new insight. So the first slide is entitled Partnering in the Business Case. So there are many types of formats of business cases, and they're readily available on the net. But I've tried to summarize here on this slide some of the main highlights. So first of all, the business case has to define the problem. And the other thing that's important is who has the problem. Oftentimes when academics identify a problem, it may be, usually in fact, it's the patient's problem. But in order to get the solution to the patient, one has to deal with translational organizations, which can be government in terms of policy. It can be pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies or medical devices companies. So that's generally in the partnering discussion the problem that you're trying to solve is how do you become part of the supply chain to translate your ideas through finally to the patient. And the next, of course, is what kind of a problem is it? Is it a financial problem? In other words, are you going to offer a solution to a problem based on lower cost? Is it an environmental problem? Is there a social benefit to your solution? Increasingly, organizations are very much interested in what's called ESG investing, which is not only investing for a financial return, but to take into account an environmental return or a social return, or even a return on governance practices. Moving on to the next main bullet, what's your solution and how will it eventually be applied? You've got to think about, in essence, if it's a product that's going to be delivered to patients, what's on the label? And then the next important piece to partnering is who are the influencers in the organization with which you want to partner. And for pharma, for example, there are many influencers. If it's a highly R&D organization, you go to conferences and identify researchers in that organization with whom you can have a dialogue with and move it up the chain. In other cases, it's also useful to deal with the local business people in your own community because they are very much interested in dialoguing with academics for a variety of reasons, not necessarily to the solution that you're offering, but to establish relationships. What are the projected returns? So you've got to think about what the financial returns are, as well as the ESG returns. And then you cannot overlook the risks. And these are sort of the main, and these risks include the business environment, which most academics are not familiar with, the regulatory environment, which many academics are familiar with and some less so, and the competitive environment, where you have to do some serious research. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is just an example of where a researcher might think they have a solution, but they've left out a serious analysis. So the first bullet is a researcher who develops a diagnostic tool that will fit the right drug for the right person and tries to launch a business with government as the payer. Because certainly in Canada, government generally is the payer for diagnostics. And what often happens here in certain jurisdictions, in certain provinces, particularly that in Ontario, is you can have a great diagnostic that you might even have proof of concept for, and you want to launch a company to sell this diagnostic into the marketplace, into people who will use the diagnostic. And as soon as it involves patients, the Ontario government, for example, has in their legislation that they will not they will not issue another license to sell diagnostics. So that immediately, if you're thinking about launching a diagnostic company and wanting to serve a province or a jurisdiction where there's a restriction on issuance of licenses, no matter how good it is, you've got to find a partner with a license in order to partner with them to get your solution to patients. Another example, and this is just an example out of my own experience, second bullet, a company develops a less expensive and arguably better retractable syringe, the advantage of which is to avoid sticks. But they run into competition from the larger sellers of syringes. And so how do those larger sellers combat the young little company with getting market traction? Well, in the business of selling devices and instruments to the healthcare system, these companies often bundle. So if a syringe manufacturer is also selling tubes, if they're also selling other elements to hospitals or to practitioners, they will compete against you by giving a discount on the rest of their products that they're going to put in the bundle, along with yours that they're putting in the bundle. And so the net economic benefit to the buyer it becomes greater because it's spread out over a larger number of products. And oftentimes small businesses and inventors don't think of what they're up against with respect to the market context. Sometimes better is not necessarily the best for the market. And that's just a general thought, because to deliver a better solution it has to fit with the people who are in the business of selling into the market. And if you're not selling into the market, and you have to partner with someone who's selling into the market, your solution may not find traction with those partners just because it's better. And so you have to assess then whether it works for sellers. The next slide, please, slide 3. So just to remind you, the fundamentals of attracting partners, right? You got to begin with the premise that a partnering deal benefits both parties. Both partners need to have their needs satisfied. You have to remember, investors and commercial partners have their own businesses to enhance and are not interested in research for its own sake, and becoming less so. You got to look for value-added partners. Don't just take any partner just because they have money, but look for value-added partners where you can move jointly your ideas and inventions towards a common goal. Have a steering committee, for example. Finding partners is difficult. You got to use a target approach. The right solution has to be for the right customer, and you've got to look at their own business. You've got to look at businesses that you think should be interested in partnering with you, and to look at what they're saying on their website of where they want to go. And don't bother with those that are not in a particular area, for example, like inflammation and immunity with respect to AllerGen. And now, how do you get traction in that organization? If you've made the right pick or picks, you got to find champions within the organization with which you want to partner, and they can be at all levels. And don't don't ignore any of those levels where you can get some traction. Can I have the next slide? So if you got something to partner, oftentimes the discussion turns to, well, maybe we should form a company, or maybe we should license to an existing player in the marketplace. And to form a company, you need to have your own business case. Whereas if you're forming a partnership, you have to think about this business case that the partner will likely have to create to push it up the management level. So you have to have a good business case and a plan. And what do companies need? It needs management. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what role do you want to play? Because if you don't want to be part of the company, you just want to put your invention into a small company thinking that you're going to make a lot of money, then what resources will you need? And you've got obviously have human and financial capital. And you also have to think of the risk, the technology risks, the financial risks. In other words, get a little bit of money, but where do you get the next amount of money from? What are the competitive risks? And what are the regulatory risks? There are some diseases for which there are great needs where the regulatory path is not quite clear, and only certain investors are willing to take that risk. Generally, investors will not take risks in all of these four categories. They'll take risks in, say, two of them, but they won't generally take risks in all of them. So if you go the licensing route, well, that's a logical thing to do if it keeps you as an academic and that's what you want, and offers both financial returns for the institution and for yourself. And if you get a royalty, it's essentially what's called a non-dilutive benefit, whereas if you form a company and you take shares in the company and you're not part of the company, your shares will eventually become less and less valuable. So I'm going to go to the next slide now. So just a slide that some of you will be aware of and some of you may not, which is, where can you find early stage partners? And I've highlighted some which are very much in the fore. Foundations in the first bullet there have often been looked on as giving grants, and they do give grants. But increasingly, they're going to their donors and arguing that they should take some of the money that they that has been donated and invest them into companies, because companies are generally closer to translation, which is what really foundations often want. Some take a longer view. And the famous one these days, of course, is the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the U.S. that took a position, invested in fact, in a company in the U.S. that led to a very blockbuster treatment in cystic fibrosis, and now has so much money from selling its shares that they don't know what, they've got to find out how to place it. And that's good for the grantees who don't have a business plan or a technology for which they're finding they're looking for money. But it's just another organization that you shouldn't overlook. And I think this is going to increase. That is foundations investing in equity as opposed to just giving grants. There are a bunch of early stage investment funds in Canada. Some of you may know of them. The first one here is one that people in BC might know well. It's called XLRX. They're partnered with the Business Development Bank of Canada, and they give basically $500,000, but it's got to be a good business plan. They have a very stellar selection committee, and they're interested in investing in businesses. And if they put the 500 in, then they go to the Business Development Bank of Canada to come up with another $5 million to get to $1 million. And they are definitely looking for opportunities. In Ontario, where I am, there's the Industrial Accelerated Fund. The IAF invests in up to $500,000 in early stage companies that have the potential to be global. And of course, they're interested in sustainable economic benefits to Ontario. An interesting program actually they have is the Youth IAF, where they're looking for people under the age of 30, and they'll invest $250,000 in innovative technology-based companies. So you see, there is money out there. I'm associated with Ontario Genomics. We have various early-stage program, as does Quebec, and I'm sure BC Genome, BC has. And these are linked to Genome Canada, all about technology transfers. So people who are doing genomics in AllerGen should really be looking at all those programs. You've got an organization in Quebec called CQDM that is looking to go across the country. They're associated with pharma, and you should really look at CQDM as they have a number of programs, including an Explore program, which I chair, which is looking for really early stage ideas. You've got your centers of excellence. In Ontario, we have the Ontario Centers of Excellence, but they exist to a variable extent across the country. And of course, big pharma and biotech that are within your area of interest are always looking for things. You've got groups like AmeriChem, who are wanting to do deals across the country. I apologize for the spelling error in licensing here. That are specifically focused on licensing deals. So if you think you want to license something to a partner, and you don't think you have enough proof of concept yet to attract the partner's interest, you can go to AmeriChem and they will help you. Of course, they'll take a piece of it. They're certainly a very interesting organization to think about. But once you have proof of concept, then of course you want to go to investors. And there are various kinds of investors that many of you will know. Angel investors are usually high net worth individuals who identify with your ideas. They can identify with it totally on because they have a relative who was affected and died of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, for example, or who has chronic asthma with constant exacerbations. Or maybe they just are interested in making money. But oftentimes the best investors, angel investors, are people who've made money in the industry. There's quite a lot of those in BC, actually, as those of you on the call in BC will know, and there's increasingly more in the rest of the country. Venture investors that I've been associated with it, you got to understand their focus. Do they like early stage or late stage or both? And are they specialized? For example, Lumira Capital rarely invest in devices. Rarely invest in diagnosis devices, diagnostics. So you got to go to those websites of those and don't contact them unless you understand what they're looking for. And ideally, find somebody who knows them that you know, and get them to give you a warm introduction. That's important. And then, of course, there are the corporate VC funds, and there's many. I've listed some here. They generally don't lead an investment. Occasionally they do, but they always like to work with other venture investors. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So just a little idea, just a little sort of philosophical slide on translating an idea into a business. So what not to do, and I've seen this so many times, I just have to say it. Don't try to commercialize your idea to fund your research. That's not the way to start to look for a partner. The other thing not to do is don't try to build a business by yourself. Find people who've done it before and build a team around you of advisors. Avoid comparing your approach to what is out there. Ideally, you want to find a white space where no one's there. And that's the ideal place you want to play. And whatever you do, if you fail to treat your investors as partners, you're going down a wrong path. So to be successful, on the right-hand slide, You got to identify a problem that can be solved by your idea. You got to solicit advice, and you have to understand your capital needs before you go to investors, and you have to target those investors. Now, you got to remember there are many business models, and investors have particular likes and dislikes for the things shown on this next slide, which is life sciences many business models. So I know that in AllerGen, as well as in other academic centers that I've been associated with, oftentimes you have an idea of an educational tool. And I'll give you two that I'm familiar with, particularly that were associated with McMaster that were quite successful. One was a textbook. There was an investigator in one of the department, not so much a textbook, but a a lab manual. Would you believe that? A lab manual. And this faculty member sells hordes of money, but not hordes enough to interest a venture investor. It's what you might call a cottage business. It's small revenue, but it's good for him. He makes money, and it's novel. And he's found partners like a reagents company to sell it on their website. And so that's another example of finding the right partner. And in this particular case, this was bootstrapped. He used his own money. Services. I know AllerGen's has been very interested in getting into the research services business with building a contract research organization. And some investors are interested in that, and some are not, including manufacturing, for example. So you have to identify investors, go on to CROs, go on to manufacturing organizations, find out who their investors are if they're not public, and then go talk to them first. Novel diagnostics or diagnostic platforms are only of interest to some investors. They're not interested generally. So, I shouldn't rule this out, but to a group like Lumira, for example, that I've been associated with, generally not. One of the problems with diagnostic platforms is you never know whether your platform is going to be a gangbuster and displace all the platforms. If you have a novel diagnostic and it's going to fly off the shelf, if you pair it with an existing diagnostic platform, that'll be easier to get a partner with. There are different rules again for medical devices or therapeutic devices. And of course, novel therapies is one that I know really well. And by far, the vast majority of venture investors, maybe 70% of the deals are done in novel therapeutics. So the business model, how you make money, that's the business model. Intellectual property is important. I won't go over this. The other thing about a business model that's very important, particularly with diagnostics and devices and software, is you have recurring revenues, because you don't want to be selling something just as an equipment sale, unless it's very expensive equipment and it's going to wear out. So but who wants equipment these days that will wear out? So the way you get that recurring revenue is once you make a sale, you pair the instrument or that you're trying to sell with consumables, reagents, for example, or if you're selling software, common, as many of you are aware, is subscription models. Finally, you got to think about maximizing profit for yourself and your investors, and ensure when you're building a business, you have to have enough working capital. Challenges for the entrepreneur. You got to understand the market. If you have a solution and you don't understand the market, is it better, faster, cheaper solution? Who are my competitors? Who are my customers? What's the sales cycle? People ignore this sometimes. For example, if you come up with a new manufacturing technology for biologics, the sales cycle roughly is about 9 months to a year. It has to be introduced early in the development plan for a product, for example. So sales cycle. So you have to understand the sales cycle, And what are the barriers to adoption? They can be regulatory, of course. And how will you get paid is very important. You've got to follow the money. And you're going to do this as an investigator, not by figuring all this on yourself. You've got to get people who've been in this field to help you. And you got to find the right kind of capital, and then you can develop your plan and your pitch deck for investors. And I'm over my time, I think, but the business plan and the pitch deck are important. The bottom bullet is really important. It's not a grant application. You can find, going to the top bullet, there are many business plan templates accessible on the internet. Work with someone who has experience. Yes, you have to have a vision and mission. You got to lay out clearly the problem and why your solution is unique. Describe the technology simply and why it will work. And if you have proof of concept, which you generally need these days, show a killer experiment. Don't inundate the investor with many experiments. They'll always ask for more if they're interested. Show the killer experiment or two. And you got to show them what you think your financing requirements are and how you're going to use the money and over what time frame. And you have to describe the management plan, meaning who's going to be in the company, what role you're going to play, who you're going to hire, and lay it out for them. You can be sure, next slide, that the plan will change. Once you get a partner to show interest, the journey just begins. The plan will be honed prior to the first check being written. Continually refine your plan, especially with respect to your niche in the market, what tasks will create value along the way, preparing for initial failure, and how to respond. And one of the things you have to do to prepare for failure is figuring out what you're doing wrong before you run out of money. So that's the end of my slides. I'm happy now to turn it over to Marshall, and I hope we can have an open dialogue. I'm happy to be challenged on some of the things I said, or alternatively give you a little bit more insight into some of the items that you might be thinking of.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much, Brian. I'm pleased to open the floor to questions from the audience now, and I would encourage you to take advantage of Brian's expertise and his willingness to ask questions on how we confront the real challenges that you're facing or the questions you have about how to advance your research or partnership and financing goals around initiatives that you're working on within AllerGen or within the broader context, any initiative that you have on the go or are planning. So you're all on mute, and to ask a question or join the discussion, you again need to raise your hand on the control panel in order to speak, or you can type in a written question and Marshall will identify you and invite you to speak. And take yourself off mute if you are using mute when you get the opportunity to speak. So Marshall, does anyone have a call at the moment or a question at the moment?
There's one hand raised, but I think it might be an error because it's been raised since the beginning. Pardon if I mispronounce the name, Manali Mukherjee. Your hand appears raised. So I'm going to unmute you, ask your question if you have one, and if your hand is raised by error, you just let us know, and I'll put the muzzle back on. You're now unmuted.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for the talk, Dr. Underdown. That was very insightful. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at McMaster in the Department of Medicine. Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
So can I please ask you a question as a postdoctoral fellow?
Please.
Right. Sometimes it's getting increasingly difficult to get research funding, especially when you're working on certain areas which can lead to a diagnostic platform maybe, or maybe a diagnostic assay. How early on within your research area should one think about patenting or licensing or using, coming to this kind of approach where you have to think about commercialization? So how early on onto your research? Because proof of concept is already there, but say the diagnostic bit, the point of care of diagnostic or something of that sort, still needs to be envisioned, but how early on in the research does one start thinking about it or making contacts with high-end influencing or key opinion leaders for that kind of investment? How
Right.
early?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. And first of
Thank
all,
you.
let me say parenthetically that having been a researcher, I'm totally supportive of people who do research for its own sake, for knowledge generation, and so on. And in fact, that's the major partner of that is government. In the case, let's take the example of a diagnostic, and I'm going to take one that might be close to home to you. I'm just guessing, but certainly will be generally familiar. The field will generally familiar to most people on the phone here, which is the following. Just recently, there have been two monoclonal antibodies, one from GSK and one from Teva, that
Yes, I am Dr. Nayar's postdoc. You have chosen the right two molecules that you're talking about.
okay. So these two companies have had very favorable reviews from the FDA Advisory Committee, and probably are likely to get approved. Now, the interesting thing about this, and I've been associated, in fact, we invested in the Teva product when it was in another company called Ception, and in fact, McMaster was one of our partners, is in analyzing what the IL-5 antibody might be useful for, it was clear that it had to be applied to patients with eosinophilic disease. And the best test at the time had been developed by the late Freddie Hargrave, which was to look at the eosinophil percentage in sputum. And so in our phase 2 trial, we did that. Everybody that was enrolled got induced sputum, and we only enrolled patients that had the right percentage of increase in their eosinophils. So I haven't looked at your technology, but I knew you were working on it. The main thing here is don't push rope up a hill. So no matter how good a test you might want to develop, if it's going to involve induced sputum, then it's got to be as simple, as cheap to do as a blood draw. And it has to be able to be taken by a non-skilled person. Well, I shouldn't say non-skilled person, but not someone who knows how to, analyze sputum. So in other words, it has to be a simple test. Now, just extending that generally to point of care, for point of care, the gold standard these days, or the target standard, there's not many gold standards in point of care diagnostic testing, but you gotta be able to do it in 20 minutes if you want to keep the patient there.
Right.
Now there may be practices where you can keep the patient longer, but patients get impatient. They want to move on. When I get my flu shot, I sit down and then as soon as the pharmacist is not looking, I leave. Right. So that's what patients want, and you have to realize in that case it has to be. I think the most for investors to invest certainly. An hour to get a point of care test with a result at the point of care in an hour is probably not going to be good enough to attract investment.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for that. Excellent.
All right, thank you for that question. Marshall, do we have any other questions?
As of present, no other hands are raised and no written questions have been submitted. But hopefully
All right,
someone's
well,
just about
Brian,
to do so.
I have a couple of questions for you, Brian.
Yeah.
I was really taken with the idea that you recommend people find champions in partner organizations. And as researchers and trainees within the network and as partner organizations themselves, we all attend a lot of conferences and meetings, but are those the best places to find champions? How do you go about this? And I realize it, is context specific depending on what kind of opportunity you're trying to take advantage of. But is there, is there a general model in your mind that you would provide advice to us on how to go about that?
Well, without making an analogy that won't be of relevance to any most people on the phone here, but I can't help doing it because I love analogies. A very famous football coach who's now deceased, his name was Vince Lombardi, said when he gave advice to his tackles and defenders, hit them hard, hit them low, and hit them often. So translated, when you look for partners, it has to be a multi-pronged approach. Just like when you're doing advertising. Advertising these days is multimedia. So let's take an example. First of all, with a therapeutic. So each of the farmers that operate in Canada have scouts. For example, the scout at Merck is a fine guy, Dr. Steve Zanadakis. There are others that I know well, and most of these scouts are very interested in hearing about what's going on. In fact, that's their job. And so take advantage, find out who the scout is, and lob in a call. And if you don't get an answer, because sometimes they're busy, then look for people that might know them. Someone else who's done a deal with that pharma company. Hey, do you know the scout? You might want to, since finding partners in the AllerGen context is about translation, you might want to go to the KOLs, that is the key opinion leaders at your various groups or within the AllerGen network. And many of those KOLs sit on advisory committees for pharma. Hey, who do you know at Pharma X or Pharma Y that you could introduce me to? And if they're responsible, they'll say, well, first tell me your idea. And they'll tell you whether they think it'll get traction. And if it doesn't get traction, then go to someone else. Don't take no for an answer initially. But if the answer comes up identically 3 times, then you better go back to the drawing board. And so that gets back to when is the right time to partner. As soon as you go to a partner or you get a scout's attention, whether it's in a device company or a diagnostic company like Abbott, for example, you should have data that shows, you should have some preliminary proof of concept data. Selling a new platform idea is much more difficult than selling a diagnostic, because then what you can do is you can take the licensed diagnostic, you can do your analysis with that under the current SOPs, and then you use your SOPs and compare the result and show it's better. Generally, better is the best. Faster is also good, particularly if you're interested in a point of care device, but Not always. For example, if you got a faster way to do one step of a process that gets the answer, but net, the overall time of getting the answer is reduced only by 10%, even though you've improved the middle step by 80%, then it's a much harder sell. Cheaper can be interesting, definitely, but only if it results in less cost to the final cost of the product. So, for example, if you have an invention that will reduce the cost of some step in a process, you can show it works better than what they're now using, but it only represents 10% of the total cost. And if it's in a high margin business, it's probably not worth that partner's time to adopt it, right? So you got to really show. So I start with the scouts. I go to your KOLs, and I would go when you go to the meetings. Instead of just talking to your colleagues, add on another group. Go around and look for. Go to the. I know most academics don't go to the showroom. Go to the showroom and see what they're showing, and say, hey, and you'd be surprised. You might find a technical person there. And if you find a technical person, now you've got somebody to talk to that you can say, well, what do you think of this? Is this of interest to you? Don't start off the conversation by saying, hey, I've got this idea. Say, hey, if someone had a solution for this, is that a problem for you? And if they say no, walk on.
That's
Now,
very helpful, Brian. I think it's interesting that you can not only find a champion, but it sounds like you can create champions within organizations if you find the right people and have a strong value proposition that they become interested in and excited about.
yeah.
In terms of the key opinion leaders, and as Brian mentioned, within AllerGen, we have a whole network of mentors and board members and advisory committee members. So please don't hesitate to contact us. That's a service that we can provide. So Brian, I want to add, are there any other questions, Marshall, from the participants?
No questions at present.
So Brian, from your experience, you see a lot of pitches, or you hear a lot of pitches, you receive a lot of potential opportunities for Lumira and other organizations to invest over your career. Where are the researchers' blind spots? Where do they most often trip themselves up because they don't know what they don't know?
Well, the first one that's often happens, most glaring, is what's your market? And you don't know how many times we see in a pitch, the therapeutics business for asthma is $6 billion. Well, so what? Because rarely do we see a business plan that's going to address the whole market. So you have to identify what your market is, what market you're targeting, what patient population you're targeting. So that is a big flaw in particularly coming from people who are new to pitching their ideas. The other is very often, for example, if it's a service business, when we see a business plan from a service business, we usually ask for 3-year financials, and we always discount it by a year. We've never seen a service business that's come to us that have hit their revenue with the first 3-year plan, and we usually then, the last slide was the plan will change. We usually get them to work their numbers up. So it's a lot of work, but work them up from the bottom up. And even after you do that, you might underestimate the sales cycle, for example. I'm just talking now about a service business. Marshall pointed out to me that there might be some people on the phone who are interested in in translating the research to influence policy. And, you know, I think the same rules apply. That is to find, if you're trying to influence policy, you have to, again, it's a multi-pronged approach. You know, you have to influence the media, you have to influence patient advocacy groups, and you have to influence government. But you have to appreciate there are some things that will change and some things that are almost impossible to change. Let me give you an example. I'm the chair of Ontario Genomics, and we get proposals to us because we have some money to help investigators to advance their ideas into translation and commercial ideas. Somebody wants to make a GMO, a new GMO. We generally, that is going to be very tough for an investor to invest in. There might be some that would invest, particularly if it's in certain markets. But then those of you who are interested in policy will say, we've got to get, and I don't, some of you may be against GMOs and some of you may be for or agnostic. I'm just using this as an example. But as an organization, if the genome centers across the country want to get government to embrace GMOs, it's a very, very hard slog. And you might say, why? You might say, well, but you know, the argument will be, well, look, there's all kinds of evidence for the benefit. There's no evidence, concrete evidence for the downside. Why not? And so you got to ask then, who are the customers? Is it the government, or is it the government's customers? Going back to knowing who the customer is, and government, the government's customers in the end are the public. So government tends to stay away from issues that will burn them. So again, and there are ways around this, by the way. You know, you got to find a way around this. Because and I've seen lots of examples where you finally get policy change. You know, so I'm not saying that new knowledge can't change policy. But it's a whole different kind of business plan, and information is only one part of, and research results is only one part of the journey of trying to change policy.
Brian, I think you're absolutely right there. There's a combination of evidence, circumstances, and values that play into those kinds of decisions, and some of those things you really can't control.
Right.
Listen, we're almost out of time. One quick question. This is the 1-minute lightning response, Brian. If you were to give our investigators and our trainees and partners on the call today one piece of advice you've learned along the way, what would that be?
Talk to people.
Talk to people.
I'm now retired. I'm not advertising here, by the way, because in the first month of January I've been busy as all get out. But just don't talk to me. Just talk to people. Don't be afraid. Don't hold your ideas to your chest. Talk to people. Think about who might help you. Embrace advice. Sort it. Triangulate the advice. And don't try to do it all by yourself.
Don't try to do it alone.
Correct.
All right, Brian, this has been a wonderful session. I'm sure there are another couple of hours of questions and discussion that we could have on this topic. But if you'd like to speak with Brian or have a mentoring meeting with Brian, then please contact Marshall. He is one of our mentors. We're very pleased that he has agreed to serve in AllerGen in that way. And he's also on our network-supported intellectual property advisory committee. So we're very, very fortunate to have Brian working with us so closely. And when you log off this webinar, there is an evaluation. It's very brief, but we would really appreciate your feedback. It helps us to prepare for our upcoming sessions, of which the next one is on March 10th, and we have a featured speaker. It's Dr. Peter Cullis from UBC. He's the Director of Life Sciences Institute there and an expert in personalized medicine. He's speaking about the experiences of a scientific entrepreneur, so that will be an exciting one. And so register as soon as possible. And again, thank you to our guest speaker today, Dr. Brian Underdown. We can't thank you enough for your time, and thank all of you for attending. And thank you, Marshall, for your technical support. So it's now time to conclude, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar series. Thanks very much, everyone.